What should you do when you can't find a good church to go to? I'm Daniel Jennings, and today we're going to answer that question. Let's be honest. It's hard sometimes to find a good church to go to. There are a variety of churches to choose from, usually in most communities, but so often people indicate that they just can't seem to find what they're looking for. It just seems like something is missing, or they're just not getting their spiritual needs met when they visit different churches. So today we want to look at, first of all, what we are supposed to get from a church, and then what we can do to find a church that does meet our needs. In the book of Hebrews, we read about how God calls us to not give up meeting together, but to come together with other Christians. It says in Hebrews chapter 10, verses 24 and 25, "And let us consider one another in order to stir up love and good works, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together, as is the manner of some, but encouraging one another, and so much the more as you see the day approaching." And what that shows us is that there's really a threefold purpose for assembling together and going to church. First is that in verse 24 it says, "Let us consider one another in order to stir up love." So the first purpose of assembling with other Christians is that meeting with those other believers should stir you up to be a person of greater love. Love for God, love for your neighbor, just a person of love in general. The next is that it says, let us consider one another in order to stir up love and good works. And so the second purpose of assembling together is that our assembly together we should be encouraged by those that we meet with to do good works. Well, what are good works? Well, good works are certainly, things like helping those who are less fortunate, being there to encourage other people when they're going through a difficult time. But I think it also has to do with, just doing the works that God has called us to do, and that is to be righteous people, be moral people, be people who love justice and take a stand for justice, and seek to do the right thing when the wrong thing is the easier path to go down. And finally it says, "Not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together, as is the manner of some, but encouraging one another, and so much the more as you see the day approaching." And what that is talking about is that it's talking about Judgment Day, and it's saying that when we meet with other believers, that time of fellowship should encourage us to live in such a way that when Judgment Day comes, God finds us as righteous, redeemed people. So the threefold purpose of meeting with other believers is that it should stir us up to be people of love. It should encourage us to do the good works that God has called us to do. And finally, it should prepare us in our own spiritual lives so that we are living in such a way that we'll be ready when Jesus comes back to judge the entire world. Now here's the thing. A lot of people make the mistake of thinking they need a big group to do that, but you don't. You don't need a big group to do that. The Bible never sets a number of how many people that you have to meet with in order for it to qualify as going to church. You just need to assemble with someone else who will encourage you in those three areas. And we see that in the Gospel of Matthew. In Matthew chapter 18, verse 20, Jesus says, "For where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, I am there in the midst of them." And what that lets us know is that you can just be in a small group with just one other person, and you're meeting the mandate in Hebrews to assemble with other people. You don't have to have a big church to have church. You can just find, Jesus says, one other person who will encourage you in that threefold area, and that is a church meeting. Now I know that flies in the face of a lot of what we've been taught. We've been taught that, well, if you're going to go to church, you have to go into a place that is this building with stained glass, and it's got a steeple on top, and it's got a pulpit, and choir loft, and a piano, and pews, and all that stuff. But the reality is that those things are later additions to the message of Jesus and the ministry of Jesus. You know, Jesus didn't go out and build any buildings with steeples and stained glass windows. He didn't build any buildings at all. Neither did the apostles, as far as we can tell. There's no evidence that neither one of them built what we would consider today a church building. What we do see instead is that over and time again in the New Testament, churches are so small that they're meeting in houses. They're small group meetings. And that's a church. That's okay with Jesus because that's how it's done in the New Testament. And what we see is that when we look at that, you know, small groups actually work a whole lot better to encourage people than bigger groups do. I've been to big churches. I think there was one I went to, it had maybe 1,400 people. Then I've been to small churches that, you know, it was just maybe 3 of us just meeting in a home. And I can tell you that I got the most spiritually out of, I was the most encouraged in the small group rather than the big, you know, the big larger congregation. And the reason for that is because when you meet with someone else in a small group setting, they can get to know you in a way that you can't be known in a huge congregation. You know, if you go to a church that has 1,000 people, how well can the pastor or the elder team know all of the people in the church? They just can't. A lot of people end up slipping through the cracks in those big congregations. And what happens is that they don't end up being encouraged and having, you know, their life spoken into spiritually the way that they would have if they had been able to meet in smaller groups where the people could get to know each other and they could make sure that those other people were being encouraged to be people of love, people of good works, and people who were prepared for Judgment Day. So, if you're having trouble finding a congregation that, you know, just you feel like is really meeting your spiritual needs, don't forget that Jesus says you don't have to go to a big established church to be doing church. You just need to find someone else who is a believer who will encourage you in those 3 areas of love, good works, and preparation for Judgment Day. You might say, well, how can I find someone like that? Well, let me tell you, if that is, you know, the direction that you want to go in, just pray and ask God to send you someone or a small group of people like that, and He will send those people to you because He wants you to have fellowship. He'll either send them in a small group or He'll lead you to a larger group, but nonetheless, He will send you those people that can be that encouragement for you because that's His will for your life. He wants you to be in fellowship with other people that will encourage you. So, you know, when it comes to finding a church, keep an open mind. Realize that it doesn't necessarily have to be a larger group. It can actually be a more beneficial and a more blessed spiritual experience if you end up doing it in a small group. I'm Daniel R. Jennings, and this is Another Life Lesson.